This week, Nautel is our benefactor. And as you know, Nautel makes all those transmitters and has the little buttons to save the tubes. They also have a Tuesday transmission talk with Mr. Welton, which you will enjoy if you have the time on Tuesday morning. Today, we're going to talk about finding and training the new guys and gals. And we have some really nice folks with us. Joyce Lieberman is the engineering supervisor at WHYY in Philadelphia. Richard Rudman is a past SBE president and contracting engineer and consultant out in the Santa Barbara area, Santa Paula, California. And we hope that Margaret Bryant will join us. Margaret had been at WQAM in Chicago. Here she is now. And the ABC networks down in Dallas. We did a very nice couple of articles back when I was doing Radio Guide about the construction and demolition of the ABC network facility in Dallas. And Margaret has some great stories about that, and we'll see where we get to. What I'm going to do here again is going to foster a conversation. Joyce and Margaret and Richard are the primaries, but if you have some comments to share, we want to hear from you. And the first thing, of course, and I'll start out by relating a thought I've mentioned before. At the Nautel Users Group at Las Vegas a couple of years ago, one of the folks from Nautel got up and said, "How many of you are under 50 years of age?" And there were like enough hands went up that you could count them on one hand. That's the problem in our industry. Whether it is a large facility, whether it is a single station where the chief engineer is the whole staff, at some point we need new people. We need new blood. And this is a concern. Mr. Pacina from he's past president, immediate past president of the SBE, that was one of his concerns. And it is also a concern up in the Wisconsin area. Madison has put together a program to bring young people into the industry. But we find the dichotomy of engineering versus IT. As I've said before, there is life above 5 volts. And at the same time, there are engineering people that get scared of all the problems with IT, the malware, the hackers. All it takes is one weekender. And what happens? Your station is corrupted by malware. So we have to have IT. We have to have them trained. We have to have them working with the tech guys. And so let's talk about that a little bit. And if I could start with Joyce and just toss it to you, first of all, how do you find people? Because you have not just WHYY, you produce fresh air for the NPR system, don't you?
Yes, we produce Fresh Air, which is a national program that's on about 400 stations in the National Public Radio system. Luckily for Fresh Air, the engineer who's been doing it has been doing it a very long time. I had done that show years ago, and that was great. We do have needs for hiring other people too. We have needs for hiring transmitter operators, people that go out to do video shoots, editing for both TV editing and for radio editing. Mostly the radio editing is done by the news reporters. I'm a supervisor and I don't actually do the hiring. I like to have some input on when the job category goes out for hire, to say who we need and what we need, but it is our chief engineer who actually does the hiring. But if it's a transmitter operator, of course you need someone that has skills in being a transmitter operator or has skills that can be transferred to that. Someone that's really curious, interested in making sure that things are done right and the sound is good, and you stick to what the manufacturer says you have to do on transmitters. We had a situation a couple of years ago where one of our transmitter operators was getting older, and someone was hired who didn't specifically have transmitter operating skills, but the younger person was able to travel with the transmitter operator for at least a year to learn the skills, and then to employ lots of the ideas that he had from his own experience. And it's really great to hire people that have IT skills. It's wonderful to work with a good IT department if you have a station that has an IT department, and to foster good relationship. But it's really good to hire people that have networking skills and computer skills.
And training is so important, as you point out. In talking to Margaret yesterday or day before, I thought it was so interesting. She commented about Westinghouse. It was Westinghouse, wasn't it, that actually hired the previous engineer on contract to be available to train the new folks.
Well, and not so much to train the new folks as it was just to be available for whatever. This was when I went to WMAQ, and it was nice that I had been transferred from Texas to Chicago, and they were breaking up. NBC was breaking up, so we were only buying the radio portion, and they actually paid the former chief engineer to be available for whatever we needed, and that was a concept I had never heard of. But it was great, because it turns out that I rarely needed him, but when you want somebody that's there, they're getting paid, so they're being compensated for their knowledge.
Quite a difference from most cases where you come into a situation and either you don't have an access to that knowledge, or sometimes the last person either died or left on bad terms, and you can't get the knowledge. You find out where the wiring problems are, or where the other operational issues are as you go along. Richard, as you are more involved in some ways in finding talent to take care of the stations that you're overlording. I don't want to say overlording. How do you find talent? How do you find somebody that you would want to trust the station with?
Well, let's look at where talent has come from in the past first. Let's talk about my talent or some of the other talents. Also, I want to give a nod to Donna Helper, who was another graduate of the WNEU School of Broadcasting at Northeastern University, and has gone on to a brilliant career of her own. But thinking about Donna and thinking about WNEU and the other staff members there, it kind of colored my thinking when I started to have to look for people when I was at KFWB in Los Angeles. And over the time that I was there, I'm trying to think, I think I hired 4 women for the engineering department. And probably the number of hires that I had available exceeded the number of men that I hired during that period of time. But where do you look? Today, I think you have to go back to look at amateur radio operators or people who are IT people who are young. One of these resources that I've been able to take advantage of recently is the 2 sons of the engineer I have out in Palmdale, Lancaster area, Kurt Hemming. Some of you may know Kurt from his Westwood One days, which he's still involved with. That's his full-time job, his day job. But I remember his kids when they were traveling along in the back seat of his car as I met Kurt to do work up in High Desert when I started 15, 16 years ago. And T and Jeff, his sons, have now gone on, and they basically are doing day-to-day inspections and much engineering at several of the stations that my main client has, and they also have other clients. So I think that to an extent, we have to look for people who might be in the family business. We have to look at amateur radio operators. We have to look at younger people who are getting involved with the Society of Broadcast Engineers. And I think we have to be willing to take chances on people to see if they can be brought along. Again, since we're living in a contract engineering world, that becomes difficult because a lot of people aren't willing to go through the hoops it takes to become a contract engineer. You have to get insurance. You have to fill out a lot of paperwork. Every time you deal with a client, you may have a new contract. One of my clients, KUSC, University of Southern California, just to get qualified as a vendor, you have to jump through hoops. I imagine it's the same throughout the NPR world, as Joyce could probably go. But I think you just have to be open to possibilities and look. And don't forget your local SBE chapter. Don't forget relatives of and children of people who have grown up around engineering. And it's a matter of keeping your mind open to possibilities, which is why one of the reasons I name my company Remote Possibilities.
Good. Excellent. Donna, I see your hands up, so let's hear from you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Mr. Rudman for the kind words. It brings me back, though, to when the two of us were in college radio. I was the first woman in the history of Northeastern University to ever be on the radio. And that's like, oh boy, good for me, I get a cookie. But my point is that back then, the best thing you could possibly do was work in college radio. Today, so many schools are closing down their college stations. I did an article for Radio World a few months ago, and I mentioned an anecdote, and it's true. Every semester, I always ask my students what their favorite radio station is. And every semester, fewer and fewer and fewer students have a radio station at all that they listen to, except perhaps in the car with mom and dad. We have done a terrible job of selling our own benefits. We have done a terrible job of promoting the fact that we're still here. Radio isn't a dying thing for old people. Radio, when it's live and local, still makes a difference, still gets listeners, still needs engineers, and that is part of the story we need to tell much better than we have been. And if I may say one other thing, I'm the advocate for an adult with autism. People wrote him off and sent him to an institution many years ago. I found him. Okay, fine, it looks sort of like a rescue, but my point is today, he has more than 350 words in his vocabulary, and he was nonverbal when I got him. I was told he'd never speak. Donna, what's your point? My point is that what Richard is saying is very, very true. Sometimes we need to do a little better job of thinking outside the box. There are people with disabilities who are very, very bright and very, very trainable and who could learn the gig. And if they were given the opportunity, boy, howdy, would they be enthusiastic. I had 2 students this semester, and then I'll shut up. Thank you for letting me speak so much. I had 2 students this semester from a program at Lesley, where I am a professor, called the Threshold Program. It's kind of a euphemism for kids with what used to be called mental retardation. These are very high functioning, very bright kids. And they have the ability to learn if somebody would teach them, and they are given the opportunity to learn a skill or to learn a trade. You can't tell me that they couldn't be taught some basic maintenance skills. You can't tell me that with a little bit of guidance, they wouldn't become enthusiastic and productive. Would they be able to do everything? No, probably not. But then again, I'm allegedly normal and I can't do everything either. So I think sometimes part of the skill set is, let's see what this person could do, and let's see if we can help to make it happen. Beyond that, you got my little note there. Tomorrow, by the grace of God, I'm 7 years cancer-free. I'm not supposed to be here at all. Every single woman in my family died of cancer, except for me and my sister. And much to the disappointment of my enemies, I'm still here.
Maybe it's the radio waves.
Yeah. I want to thank everyone for welcoming me, for having me in. If you ever want to talk about media history, I'm your person. But I wanted to be here today to just see a whole bunch of my old friends. And the emphasis is not on old, the emphasis is on friends. Because you know what? We all get by with a little help from our friends. And friendship really is the greatest gift.
Thank you, Donna. Appreciate that. Appreciate that very much. Joyce, as you bring people in, chief engineer is vetted and turned on to you. What kind of training regimen do you have? Do you throw them in and see how they, throw them in the water, see how they swim? Or do you have an arrangement in which you work to bring them up to speed?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's different for different jobs that we have. So if someone is on target to be a production engineer, then they need to learn how to record programs. They need to know how to edit on Pro Tools. We use Pro Tools here for digital audio editing. So if we're going to be training someone to eventually do our live call-in show, we first put them on a production shift where they're recording different people. So we train them on getting good audio levels. We train them on using the console. At this point, we have Axia consoles. And then they're able to do a production shift. Then we take them into learning how to do one of our shows, which is a live call-in show. It's called Radio Times. It's a local show. And they get several weeks of training because we don't want to put them on the board and they're not getting the timing right. Mostly after you've learned how to manage the levels, then you have to get the breaks at the right time. We have 3 breaks. It's kind of styled after National Public Radio type of breaks. Every 20 minutes, there's a break. So they get to go through the paces of that. And then hopefully they'll adapt to it very well. And we've had engineers that have adapted well. We recently had a new engineer, a woman that was in our media services department. She would handle a lot of, I guess, conferences when we had live conferences and then Zoom conferences when we went over to COVID. And we weren't doing as many conferences. So she was asked to be part of the engineering group. And she got that training and she's gotten really good at it. Luckily for us, she's really good at so many things. So I've been able to show her lots of the maintenance tasks that I do. And she's very inquisitive and takes notes and wants to learn all of those things. But hopefully someone will take on the task of the local radio show. And then when they get good at that, then we also show them how to do the fresh air program too. So I mentioned that we have a main engineer who does fresh air. However, she needs to have breaks and holidays. So we have, right now, there's 2 other people who are proficient at it. And then as new people come on, we like to train them on that. So again, they might sit in on an interview and they could see how we set that up. And with COVID, we've had to do a lot with Merlin, Tyline, and Report It. So it has broadened our skills of working with lots of different applications, but they'll get proficient at that. And then at some point they'll be training to do the live feed of the show. So I think that answers some of what you were asking.
Yes, very good. Tim Braddock left a note here, and Tim, maybe you could comment a little further. WRBB in Boston, he is assigned one of the students to do some things and teach them some others. Tim, you want to comment? Sometimes I catch people off guard this way. Well, okay, I'll move on to Margaret then, if you don't mind. And Margaret, you have experience locally, but also with national networks, and the area in which you can make mistakes and not be killed is much narrower there. Would you say?
From an RF standpoint, yeah, well, I don't know, from an RF standpoint, yeah, you can't kill yourself as easily on the transmitter, but when you do make a mistake, you affect far larger numbers of people.
So now when you moved from MAQ down to Dallas and constructed a beautiful facility, which oddly enough, you had to deconstruct.
Yes, it's now it's about to be apartments. I was there a couple of weeks ago after they've long torn down the building. And yeah, they're in the process of constructing apartments there. Very sad. It's a great facility.
So did you find it difficult to hire people for such an intensive workspace? Or did you start them out in less intensive areas and then bring them up to on-air work?
Well, so because we were not union, all the operators were combo. So all the on-air stuff was all combo. So so all of the engineers that I had were the ones that were all of the infrastructure behind the scenes, and nobody was actually working on the air. I
see. Well, Richard, you had the experience of working a union shop in LA and had to deal not only with the talents or lack of talent of an employee, but also union rules. And noise from phones.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, well, it started out as union, but the story of KFWB was kind of interesting. It turns out that the local area never actually certified with IBEW. So they had a certification election, and Margaret may remember some of this peripherally, but that resulted in the bargaining unit not wanting to certify with IBEW. And Westinghouse management at 90 Park thought that was a great management victory. I realized it for what it was and tried to explain it to some of the corporate lawyers that Margaret and I had to deal with, that it really was the fact that the local bargaining unit hated their business manager with a passion. He was a jerk. And but still in all, when I arrived at KFWB, I had 17 people working in the department. And some of those people are still around quite late in my 27 years there. I managed to get a lot of them through to retirement in spite of themselves in some cases. But the union issue really never came up much because I had so many people. If anything, I was working with a management structure that wanted me to get rid of people. And I had to construct a facility that was able to have people work through the glass initially, and then transition to combo operation. Margaret saw that facility, and it was actually somewhat copied a little bit. It was really the first station that was actually built as an all-new station that I'm aware of in the country. We had 10,000 square feet without a post in it. We could do anything we wanted with it. within budget, of course. But I never really thought of the union as an issue in that because of my situation there. Later on, when I was hiring people, I didn't. It was a non-union shop, so I didn't have to worry about that sort of stuff. I want to go on to one thing to pick up on where we're going with this, and I'd like to hear Bert Weiner's thoughts on this because I've learned a lot over the years through my friendship and professional association with Bert, and I consider him a mentor. And those of you who are ham operators, ham radio licensed operators, might be familiar with the term Elmer. And an Elmer in amateur radio is a helpful mentor to younger amateurs or inexperienced amateurs to help them get from the stage of not knowing much about radio to being functional, valuable operators. And Bert, maybe you have some comments on this whole thing.
Well, yeah, I do. And I was particularly interested in Donna's comments about, bringing people along and they may surprise you at their abilities. I'm kind of a believer to some extent that if you're looking for RF people, good transmitter people, people that will learn about antennas and, RF networks and stuff like that, I've kind of felt all along that these are people that are born this way. They're not people you just bring in and teach. And that's sort of different than IT. When I'm out, and going back to what Donna was saying, when I'm out doing work at a station, and I always ask that the chief engineer be with me for two reasons. And the first reason is they know their plant, hopefully. So if I'm doing something out there and I knock something off the air, they know where the on button is. This is, obvious things like that. They know what's built there. But when I'm working on something, I talk out loud, and I want the engineer there with me, and I'm talking about what I'm doing, why I'm doing, and I will even stop and draw pictures of how I'm doing things and why I'm doing things and what the signal looks like. For example, doing an NRSC, people will look at a spectrum analyzer and they're not familiar with it. They don't know what they're looking at. And I'll make the analogy to them that in a radio, which they're kind of scarce now, the ones with a knob where you can tune it and you can go across a signal and you can go between signals, the old analog tuning knob. And that is, I'll make the analogy of, or not analogy, but I guess a way to relate to them is as you're tuning across and there's no signal there, and as you come up on a signal, you hear the buckshot, the sidebands. No, I shouldn't say buckshot, but the sidebands. And it's, as you tune across a little further, you come out, it gets a little bit more legible, a little bit more legible. Then you tune up on the carrier, and there's the signal there, the main signal. And as you keep tuning across, you get on the other side, and you go down the other side of it. And here's the next little space, and here's the next signal. Well, I said, and then I point to the spectrum analyzer, the display on the spectrum analyzer. I mean, they understand what I'm talking about tuning a radio. Most people in this industry have somewhere along the line tuned a radio with an analog knob on it, a dial, so they can relate to that. But then when I explained to them that what you're seeing on the spectrum analyzer is a graph of this, that you're taking a narrow slice of this signal or of the receiver, and you're sliding it across the dial, and this thing is drawing the graph of the signal. And they relate to this, and they can understand it, and all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense to them. And if I see someone that's interested in, wants to know what I'm doing, boy, I'll grab them and I'll teach them whatever I can. If I'm making, you know, impedance measurements or measurements in an array, I'll talk to them about what I'm doing and why and how this all interfaces to stuff. And I like doing that. And sometimes you find someone that really stands out and really wants to know. Other times you find you're talking and you turn around to look at them and they're not there. They're back at their computer. Where'd they go? Well, they're just not interested. So there you are. But I believe to a great extent, people that really deal with RF in transmitters and antennas, I think to a great deal they're born. Amateur radio is a great way to learn this stuff, hands-on experience. That's mainly where I got a lot of my experience. Plus, thankfully, I've had a lot of mentors along the way myself that have taught me stuff and used analogies that I could relate to. So that's kind of it.
That's good.
Basically.
That's good. Being able to train. Joyce, if come back to the studio, we have to have knowledge of RF, audio, and FCC rules. This week we had a NALF, Notice of Parent Forfeiture, come down because an air talent decided it would be a good stunt to play an EAS tone on the air as part of his shift. The board op at the station in Las Vegas caught it, reported it, but before that, the FCC got wind of it and brought down $20,000 fine. Mm. Do you find that it's necessary or that your people care about what's part of their programming?
I find that they care, but in addition to that, there has to be ongoing training. So I've been working here for about 40 years, and I need to transfer lots of the skills that I have, lots of the tasks that I have to other people. One thing that I'm in charge of is EAS. So our chief engineer is ultimately in charge of it, but I've been designated the person. So in the last 6 months with one of my other operators, we came up with a guide for how we do the EAS here. So besides the EAS FCC handbook, which I go around like every 6 months and go through the book with people and tell people they need to read that, I have guidelines on how we enter all the required weekly tests, required monthly tests, you know, what's required of us. So people are familiar with that. And as an ongoing effort, we need to do that. And I need to do that with lots of other aspects here. So we have lots of documentation, signal flow, we have cable drawings, we have a new system, Axia system. So that's all documented a certain way, and we're supplementing the documentation. So there's lots to hand off to people. And I'm not handing it off to the person doing Fresh Air or the person doing our local talk show, but we have other engineers who have more time and can kind of sit in for me if I'm not here. So I have an ongoing training, and I have a list of things that people get trained on, and I go through the list besides the maintenance that I'm doing. And I'm showing other people how to do some of that maintenance too.
That's good. That's good. Margaret, being on the tech side more than the programming side, but still, you mentioned that many of the combo operations there, and I would assume that you had more FCC responsibilities than the programming people. How did you keep the air staff from wandering into areas they shouldn't be?
Actually, I didn't. Well, later on, I didn't do that because usually that was the programming people. Early on in my career, when I would have to train people on that kind of thing, because I was the one actually doing the license renewal and all of that too. But those are the way back days. There. A lot of times it was just discussions with people, whether it's at a programming meeting or something like that, to get people to understand you know, what kinds of things were allowed and what kinds of things were not allowed. I think everybody pretty much knew, at least generally, what was allowed and what wasn't allowed.
But what you just said is such a key in so many areas, having meetings, having a discussion, letting the tech people and the IT people and the air people all talk together, not just at a Christmas dinner, but on a regular basis to understand. Richard?
Yeah, actually, that takes us into an area that we don't often talk about, but wind up having to deal with, and that's interpersonal relationships. When you bring somebody into a group of people who has to relate to other people. And I would say, as far as training is concerned, that's something that, like Bert said, you have to find people who may have it within themselves to begin with to understand how to play nice with other people. I've had employees who I've hired who really were problem children. And I won't mention any names, but they, in some cases, they were their own worst enemy. I remember in one case, actually, it was just before I left, I was talking with one gentleman, and I basically said, "Look, I've done my best to try to help you with these issues, but I'm not going to be here anymore." Well, 6 months later, after I had left, he wasn't there either. And finding people who can work with other people goes to 180 degrees against a tendency that I find in good engineers. Good engineers, good people, technical people, good hands-on people, sometimes we're more comfortable with things than with people.
Yes.
Yeah, and Richard, I think you bring up a good point, because I know at ABC Radio Networks, you were dealing with all of the formats. You were dealing with the jocks on one hand, and then you were dealing with the affiliates on the other. And my guys were the ones, in a lot of cases, that were taking a lot of the phone calls and a lot of the complaints, whether that is the jocks who have to require a certain way of talking to them, and the affiliates, another way of talking to them. Certainly with the affiliates, in some regards, that was harder, because the thing that I wanted them to say was, you can never tell the affiliate it's their problem, even if it is. What you do is you start asking them questions until they start coming around to their own thinking, that they realize that it's their problem, without actually saying that. Training people to do that was very difficult. They could sit there and they could take care of the satellite uplink transmitter, and they could take good care of the audio vault and all of those kinds of things, and the PRNE consoles. But when it came down to actually working with the people, you're right. You bring up a good point. That's a very important component that you have to consider.
Yeah, there's another aspect of that has to do with the facility too, and that's teaching people how to work in a studio that's on the air without panicking, spooking, or otherwise disturbing what is going on over the microphone.
Well, also it's the redundancies too, because see, at ABC we had a nice setup. We had a good, so there was the IT department, which took care of all of the office IT, and there was the broadcast side, which we sort of had our own IT department, and they talked to each other and they helped each other out. And the one thing, because, you know, we're talking about pre-ransomware and all of that, the one thing the IT department did not understand was our desire to be on the air at all costs. And so some of the things that we implemented, which were, you know, like sneaker nets, they thought back then was a waste of time, but we never ever had any problems either. And so it was sometimes difficult talking with them, but unlike a lot of locations that I've heard about, we got along really well. They did their thing, we did our thing. We made sure that if we had to interact with each other, we did what we were doing wasn't going to interfere with them, and vice versa. So it worked out really well.
Yeah.
Margaret, I assume that's Satellite Music Network?
Yes, it was ABC. By the time I got there, it was ABC.
Okay. David Cantor?
Yep.
Well, there's the other direction too. It's how you, at your level in the engineering department, interact with management.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And it goes to how do you eventually teach somebody or learn yourself how to convince people to spend money when they don't want to spend it. And if you don't learn that skill, or at least have an appreciation that that's a factor, sometimes you can talk yourself into thinking that you're not being that you aren't appreciated. When in fact, one of the factors may be is you haven't learned how to explain things properly to be able to get what you want.
Yeah, back when I was at WMAQ, that was one of the compliments that the general manager had given to me, was he had never had an engineer that worked for him before that could explain things in ways that he understood. And that's you gotta do that. But the couple of years, many years before that, I remember talking with the chief engineer. We had no budgets then. It was an FM station, and we had no budgets. And so anytime I wanted anything, I had to ask for it. And so I wanted a new tube, a new final for the transmitter. And the general manager just looked at me and he said, "Well, I just bought you a new exciter. Why do you want a tube now?"
Mhm.
And I just looked at him. I said, "You didn't buy me an exciter. You bought the station an exciter. Because if it was my exciter, it would be home in my living room." And he didn't particularly appreciate that very much. And but I did get him to understand why we needed a new tube, and we got the money. But yeah, it really is important, because I consider that to be a skill that that was valued any place that I worked, was that I could bring complex subjects down into something that they could understand.
That's an important but very hard to teach quality
Yeah.
and necessary, because yes, too many owners, GMs view the engineering, even the IT department, as cost centers, not income centers. And they really don't like to spend money on what they consider a cost center.
So you have an oil and water kind of skill set. The engineers are typically not sellers, but you have to, there's a concept of, engineers tend to think this is a debate. That is, if you know what I know and you read the homework and the detailed memos, you'll believe what I believe and you'll do what I say. When it's not, it's a seduction. This is I see your insulin pump. Can I interest you in another piece of cheesecake? I'm selling you something that may not be good for you, but that's the extreme of sales. Now, there's a long way between being helpful to management and that evil, slippery slope out there where you're actually hurting people. But so much of it is saying, here is something you can do for progress. Very few people object to progress having a price tag. It's just getting them to realize you're going to have a spare. You're going to have two of something. We all want to be on the air, but let's take some steps to get there. And this will have a price tag. But
although, sometimes that doesn't work either. I used to get all the time at ABC, I used to get, we want to do X, and I'd go, okay, where's the money coming from? And well, and I can't tell you the number of times that I drew up budgets for stuff that never happened. And it was, it came down to, well, sometimes they would tell me, will you figure out where the money's coming from? And I'm going, no, this is not my project. I am not figuring out where the money is coming from.
And as organizations got much larger, those priorities could change, that suddenly you've done nothing wrong. Everyone on your staff team group have filled out all the forms for 5 years. It is their turn to get some goodies. I'm thinking of consoles, but if they come in and say, TV needs, $80 million that wasn't budgeted, I said, I only had a few million to start with. Half of it's contractual. If we don't spend this money, we will be sued. The other half is people who've waited their turn to keep things from falling apart.
Well, David, glad to have you along here, because you administered a large number of stations with the two groups. Well, it was one group that became another group, wasn't it?
We had a lot of names. We had 6 names on the glass door. We stopped having the windows cleaned because the sign painters would take care of it.
So now, how did you, with your varied engineers in different cities, how did you get them to understand the need to explain things, not in technobabble, but in a term the GM could understand? Or did you make them come to you rather than to go directly to management?
One from column A, one from column B. With very few exceptions, they were better technicians than me. The skill I had was I could manage engineers pretty well and while being only kind of a so-so one myself. I loved it as much as anyone ever did, but you realize you may be more patient about filling out forms than your average local. Things like software, I'd buy and generate maps and channel studies and goodies like that. I didn't want everyone local to have it because it would be like issuing video games. It'd be like sending Nintendos everywhere. Productivity would drop off. But mostly our engineering managers were very bright and they were very good at talking to other managers. We had very few problems with that.
That's good. Joyce, did you ever have to disemploy somebody?
We have had to do that here. I didn't have to do it personally, but I was in the discussions of how this was happening. And that's very disconcerting because you try to get people on board, you know, all the time. You work with people, if they're not coming up with the skills, with the tasks that they need to do, people are told. And then over time, it's clear that it's just not happening. So occasionally that does happen. Fortunately, it doesn't happen very much. I guess there's certain gradations of things that go on. Like we've had some brilliant engineers who personal skills aren't great, but I'm an advocate of bolstering the person with the incredible engineering skills and not casting them aside because their interpersonal skills aren't great, you know, as long as they could get the task done. But I think what you're asking is when someone really can't get the task done or is continually, you know, not there or calling out sick and stuff like that, you do occasionally have to do that.
It's not a happy thing to do, especially in an industry here where we have reduction in number of people to begin with.
Mhm.
But at some point, sometimes you have to deal with someone that doesn't want to do the job. They want the money, but they don't want the job.
Yeah, Barry, I'd like to offer some ideas on that. First of all, both Margaret and I are veterans of the Group W School of Management. And one of the things that we actually were sent to some very interesting classes and courses over the years and meetings. And we also grew up at a time in management when human resources was actually at the beginning what it was supposed to be, an employee advocate. But part of the process that I learned, and I still remember and still use, is performance review. And if you are doing a valid performance review with an employee, you sit down with that person once or twice a year, and you review their performance. And it really, what I used to do is, my take on it was to tell people, look, we're not going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what you've done. Let's just look back over the year and realize that if I've been critical about you on something or complimented you, that those were my feelings at the time. In other words, as an employee, you should know where I stand. You stand with me any day you walk in the door. And if it comes time to part ways, I basically felt myself that at that point in time, that person has demonstrated to me they no longer want to walk in the door. And that made the discussion easier for me to have with that person. because they were the ones that convinced me they no longer wanted to work for me, not the other way around.
We're back to communication
Yeah,
industry.
just something I wanted to comment on too, that as Richard is talking about, is sometimes you run into people that they don't understand why they're there, or they don't, they don't understand that they're not doing the job. They just don't understand. And one of the things, there's two things that we all talk about IQ and a person's intelligence, but there's also a thing that I'm sure you're all aware of course, is a person's EQ. That is their emotional quotient in how they relate to other people and with compassion and to be able to understand what another person is going through and what kind of person that is. Dealing with having to let someone go, I've had to do that only a few times, thankfully only a few times. And it's really painful to deal with. For me, it is. And because you have to have compassion for the other person, unless they're a jerk. Jerks make it easy. And there are a few jerks, but you try and pull someone along, and if they're not going to work out, sometimes it's just necessary to cut the cord, so to speak.
You have to fight the desire to defeat the interlocks and ask them to go in the transmitter. Lark, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I unmuted my mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, first I must say hi to Margaret. Wow, Margaret, what a rock star. It's so cool to see you on here. So hi.
Good to see you too, Lark. It's been a long time.
Yeah, Margaret, I was in Dallas for many years, and Margaret was so kind. And anyway, we're not going to get into a love fest, but I'm one of her biggest fans. Couple of thoughts, and guys, I've been offline, on and offline, so I may have missed some things. So if this is helpful, I'll just mention a couple of things. When you were back on the topic of where to find help, I find the Guitar Center, Sam Ash, those are probably one of the best places to find people if you haven't discussed that already. Best done by researching, going in like you're going to buy some stuff, particularly Avid. A lot of these wannabe jukebox heroes have stolen every piece of software available on the internet, and I've learned every knob and every twist, which essentially is part of their 10,000 hours of really becoming pretty good, and that shows a lot of interest. So I just wanted to put that up if that hasn't been mentioned before.
All right. You said you had two?
I'm sorry?
You said you had two things?
Yeah, the other thing is, please keep in mind, I get to switch gears here. When you hire somebody, make sure, or train somebody, make sure they're capable of handling an FCC inspection. Now, this becomes important. I can't tell you how many times we may need to visit someone and the engineer is not available. And, that's not an excuse, and that's a possible violation. So
not that the engineer is not available, but there's no one to talk to you.
Well, if we're there and there's no one to talk to us, then that could be a failure to allow inspection.
Right.
So to avoid that, I think one possibility is to, and this is true not only for regulation related issues, this is true for technical issues, just about everything, but everybody should have their "If I'm Hit by a Truck" book well written and updated, and part of that should be regulatory compliance. So if you're asked to be inspected, that even if they're not familiar with it, they can follow the script, and I think that will go a long ways. I just wanted to I have a lot of other thoughts, but I think that's enough for this one.
That's a whole topic all by itself that we could certainly discuss. sorry, we could discuss if I got hit by a truck or somebody else.
One of the things that I wanted to mention was people talking about getting along with other people. And let's face it, that there are a lot of technical people, whether you are in doing RF work or you're doing IT work, that are introverts. And they don't like dealing with other people, or they're uncomfortable dealing with other people. And I found that to be the case with my staff at ABC. I found it very interesting to see which ones I assigned which topics and which ones were the ones that were able to talk with some of the other people. And the ones who were introverts, those are the ones I spent a little bit more time with, helping them along and getting them so that, you know, giving them suggested answers and that kind of stuff, or approaches on how to handle things, because I wanted them to be able to eventually get to the point where it's kind of that mentoring process, only in this particular case, it's about communication rather than electronics.
So you're saying, as an astute manager, you need to really evaluate your workers to understand what their needs are.
Well, and to me, if you're a good worker, a good manager, you're going to realize that every single one of the people on your staff are motivated by different things. I know that the manager that I used to have, my boss, was terrible. She was motivated by money, so she thought that everybody was, and it's like, no, I wasn't motivated by money, and she never understood that. And I understand that you know, each one of my staff people were motivated by different things, and so I try to address those different things, because everybody's different, and if you want to get the best work out of them, then you have to treat them like everybody's different.
We're back to communication. We're back to getting meeting, talking, understanding. Rich, you got your hand up.
Oh, which Rich?
Rich Hahn.
Both of us.
Yeah. Okay. Rich Hahn first.
Can you hear me okay, Barry?
Absolutely.
Okay. You know, this kind of reinforces some of the things that have been said already, but one of the key things that's needed with somebody in this business is not just curiosity, but intense curiosity. And that curiosity has to be not only about the technical side of the business, but also in the other parts of the business. I mean, and this fits in with the communications thing and fits in with the personal development thing. You have to be able to, you know, bone up on what the salespeople are doing with, or what the programming people are doing with. It's benefited me a lot to have spent some time on the air. I know what it's like to, you know, die while a mic is open because of a technical problem. It helps understand what's going on for other folks when that kind of thing happens. I can think also of another example. I remember a time when I had my most of myself inside the back of a transmitter, and the sales manager comes along and says, "How long are we going to be off? Can't you just talk to that thing and make it work?" You know, I was trying to methodically divide and conquer, parsing out the problem, and he says, "Well, can't you just talk to it?" And on first impulse, that kind of a thing, you think, what are you talking about? Can't you just talk to it? But that's how a sales manager works. That's how he sells the product, and he's got to sell a non-tangible, and he's so used to relating to people and talking with them. That's the way he solves his problems. So, you know, I learned that part of how they're wired is very different than how I'm wired.
One of the things along those lines, if I can comment just for a second, every really successful salesperson I've ever known says the same thing. It's all about relationships. Those really successful ones, that's where they're at. And that just ties right in with what you were saying.
Barry, I want to talk about something else that we haven't talked about, and that's job interviews. When you
Very good, because just after you, we want to hear from Ron Castro.
Okay. I wanted, when I was interviewing people or for tech jobs and they were going to be on the overnight shift or have to go to transmitters or deal with things like that, one of my favorite questions to ask them is, tell me about a time when you panicked. And first of all, if somebody says, well, I never panicked, I know they're lying. But it opens the door to a discussion on what my expectations are if you get called to a transmitter late at night and you feel you have the weight of the world on your shoulders because it's never happened to you before. And how do you clear your head and concentrate on working the problem rather than working the panic?
Good point. Ron, you want to talk about interviewing people?
Well, that's something that I'm hoping to do very soon. I just wanted to let everybody know that we have a full-time job opening for a chief engineer in Redding, California. And by the way, I've gotten some very, very good advice from the folks that you've had on here today. I thank you all very much for that. This job has full benefits, and it's a very nice facility. You can see Mount Shasta and Mount Lassen from the studios. So it's good. 5-station cluster, Northern California. It's in a part of California that's not horribly expensive to live in. So for folks that are saying they don't want to move to California because they know it's expensive, if you're talking San Francisco, Sacramento, places like that, yeah, it is expensive. Redding, not so much. It's a very, very nice place to live. I've even thought about retiring there in, a few decades when I get to do that. The company itself is good. It's not run by a bunch of bean counters. I'm one of the owners of the company, so engineering does not get short shrift. We get big budgets to work with, big relative to some of the other departments, and we take engineering very, very seriously. We must be good employers. About half the employees at that Redding cluster have been with us for over 20 years. So good place to be. If you're interested, if you know somebody who's interested, I'd like to hear from you. You can shoot me an email at eng@resultsradio.com, or get to me on Barry's list. I monitor that continuously. And thanks for letting me put this on, Barry.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Mark?
Preceding was a commercial announcement.
How much do I owe you for that?
I have a quick comment, and that is, I'm sure everybody here knows, but when you're interviewing a potential employee, they are also interviewing you. And there's been, in the distant past, places that I was interested in going to work for, and they were interested in hiring me. And I went through the interview, and I realized part way through the interview that this was not a company I wanted to work for. And so you got to remember, it's a two-way street. And I've seen too many times where an employer will wine and dine a potential employee, and once they become an employee, the honeymoon is over, so to speak. And that's when the employee might start looking for another place. So if you want to keep an employee, you got to treat them with respect. It's a two-way street.
Very good.
You got to respect each other.
Very good point. Mark?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment on the fact that passion has to play into a lot of this. A passion for the kind of work that's involved. There are some people out there that are doing this, and like I've heard talked about, yeah, they're doing it for the money. But passion is a big thing, and those of us that have done it for so long, we do have that passion. We're not bothered by getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning and going out to a transmitter site when you have snow and hurricane force winds like we do in Nebraska. But passion is really important. I just wanted to throw that in there, and I do appreciate everybody's comments. It's been great to be able to sit in on this. We have the same issues here in Nebraska. We're running out of engineers and we need to find more. And we're, our SPE chapter here in Omaha has been really trying to come up with some ways to interest people into doing this sort of thing. We're kind of looking at the younger crowd, high school age kids before they go to college. Hey, would this happen to be something you might like to do? One thing we did find here in Nebraska, there at one time there used to be several vocational tech schools here in Nebraska that taught electronics. There's not a single one that teaches even basic electronics anymore.
It's a problem.
So, that's something that we've got to take into account in trying to recruit people. That's all I have, Barry. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. Greggy?
Just a quick thing, bouncing off of what Margaret said earlier. I was really intrigued by Margaret's comments about how to understand different personalities and approach them. I spent 30 years at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, starting out as an outside contractor for one little low power station. And 30 years later, I retired after having helped build that into a 9-station, half the state network. During that time, the university offered to management level people a number of different seminars and week-long 2 hours a day teaching experiences where they would give you different new skills about how to manage, how to run your department, blah, blah, blah. And one of them I remember was a very carefully designed program to assist you in ascertaining the personality types of each of the people who works for you and each of the people for whom you work in a circle that was basically divided into quadratures, and people up here and people up here and people over here and people over here had different personality types that were almost at times contradictory. And yet a person wasn't always in one quadrant. They were kind of mostly in one, but they might cross over into one of the other three. And they taught you how to deal with each different personality type for the best outcome. Because different employees of yours and different supervisors that you might have are driven by different goals. They're excited by different types of information. And so learning how to do that changed my management style totally. And my last 5 or 6 years at that university turned out to be the easiest time I ever had dealing with people. And there was a time when I could not deal with people. That's all.
Thank you. Lark?
Checking mic, can you hear me?
Yep.
I wanted to just appreciate Richard, whoever it was that brought up the passion. I'm surprised I forgot to mention it, but on that whole look for the kids at Guitar Center, a lot of them want to be rock stars or, in the entertainment business. And even if you're in whether LA or Nebraska, this really gets them from maybe a $10 or $15 an hour, whatever they're making, or commission, into the entertainment business. And they're usually, doing a remote at a bar or club where there's a live band fascinates them, or if the record reps come into town. So again, the passion thing, I'm disappointed that I didn't think to mention that, because that was a big part of why I would always shop for people for Premier Radio Networks at the Guitar Center down in Ventura, and because it gave them a chance to see Elton John when he came in. Oh, that was LA. But in Nebraska, it might be, hey, you're going out and you're doing stuff, you're getting free food, which, want to be rock star, free food and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to say, excellent point on the passion. And that's one of the reasons why I like shopping for people at Guitar Center.
It really is important, the passion, because, well, let's face it, we're not on a 9 to 5, 5-day-a-week job. As Mark said, you could get called at 2 a.m., you could get called on a weekend or whatever. The chat things have pointed out that as Mark said, all the schools they're gone. Finding training. Joyce, is there anything in your part of the world where you send your people to gain education in a structured environment, or do you provide it all, or do you send them off to NAB?
We often take advantage of training programs that people can do.
Oh, you just froze. We'll get back to you if you can hear me. Richard, I wanted to mention.
Barry froze.
Barry froze. Okay.
There you
Barry,
go.
you see me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. It usually going off to places is just too costly, although I could see the merit in, taking different courses. Often it's different training programs that we get in here.
Well,
Right.
that's all good. And, we talk about the ability. Richard, when I first got pulled into SBE by our buddy up in Phoenix, you in chapter 47 in LA were very much into the education. You were sharing materials, and each chapter could get some of these materials from you. And this has changed. Now, I don't want to denigrate the SBE experience, because there's a need for folks to get together. But if it's only a vendor pitch and a piece of pizza, that doesn't solve the problem of education.
No, it doesn't. Probably, if I know where I go now to learn something quickly that I need to know, and that's YouTube. But it's amazing the range of things you can find on YouTube to get knowledge on. But that's not a school, and it's not hands-on. What I have to look back to amateur radio and say that radio clubs, local radio clubs, and that kind of experience and mentorship are, to me, still the best ways to do it. I've gone to a lot of conventions. I did go to Madison when it existed, when John Battison was running it once, and enjoyed that thoroughly. But those experiences now are probably not going to happen very much to the extent they used to. And I think we're all floundering for ways that we could do that education. But I think we've covered most of the ways that people have thought of. And if anybody comes up with something new, I'm sure anxious to hear it.
David Stewart's got a wonderful one here.
I didn't leave. I just, am I supposed to read it?
No, you can read it, or you can tell it out. You can. With my hat as a local station owner, a longtime goal, and I think the absolute best proof that I'm out of my tiny little mind. We've worked with several principals, a couple of superintendents. The idea was, let's involve young people in radio, and I've learned a thing or two about finding them. Traditionally, you'd go to the teachers, said, tell me about your class clowns. Class clowns would come in. Not one of them was the person. But they always bring some real quiet kid who sits back in the corner watching it. That's the person you're looking for. But we've changed administrators. And these days, this may just be Texas, but I assume the things that wreck our schools wreck everyone's. We teach to the test. If you're not doing the STAR or TAX or whatever tests, and broadcasting and communications and speech, sales club kind of things we used to have, future business people, we don't have a lot of that. It's, we used to teach a lot of stray skills. So now you ask for interns from the schools.
And that's remarkably difficult, because your average kid today, I don't meet a I don't meet anyone in school whose schedule is not way busier than mine. Between their stuff, demands on their time, the things the parents are working on. You know, I was allowed to run loose. You know,
do you do it in terms of having them on the air or operating the console, or how do you say 15?
Nowadays I look for podcasters. If I can find anything local and they have anything to say, I ask, can I excerpt that and play bits of it on the radio? Then if they have any interest coming down, we'll show them what we're about. And usually you work your way up to guest on some program. You either call in or Skype in or something. And I like to say, I'm not really looking for future employees, but we used to have many of them. I'm in a building where we had 15 or 16 people full time. Nowadays, they're 2 full time and 2 part time. I don't count myself because basically I bought a building that has a business in it, and I use all the old offices to store things for the contract engineering business.
We could see that.
Remember, this is only about half practical. Part of this I saved as pictures after the Barry took a bunch of pictures of this one day, and I thought since then said, well, we'll save the pictures. But like I say, some of this is not really hardware.
You should have seen it before he cleaned it up.
Well, and you should have seen it before Ken retired and dumped off stuff. He headed to his new home, drove by, and there are things in my front hall that are from the Ken collection.
Okay.
Many of them available at reasonable prices. We have a deal. If you want to come by, see our showroom, you'll love it.
Margaret, anything that you'd like to add at this point?
No, not really. I think that it's harder these days, harder than ever before, to find the right people. Because I know that it was hard back when I was still at ABC to find people, because we had one person from SMN, we had one who had done some satellite uplink work, we had another guy who did worked at the local sound equipment place. You never knew where you were going to find them. And then it was up to you to bring them up to speed on all of the other things that they needed. And I made sure that I had a couple of people that were really good on RF and a couple of people who were really good in, you know, the IT kind of stuff. And then there were some that were just generalists. There was a lot of cross training involved, but you never know where you're going to find the next one. And a lot of times they don't come prepared with any knowledge about RF. And I will agree with those who have said that that's kind of a specialized person, because that's just not something that these days that anybody even thinks about, despite the fact that there's so much stuff that there's RF everywhere and people just don't realize it. And, you know, so it's tough these days.
Exactly.
So much of that is board swapping type RF, small things that astounding capabilities that we never would have. Computer meets multi-gigahertz RF device.
I just want to add a comment here about RF and digital and everything else. And that is, in my opinion, I mean, someone may want to argue with me, you may be digital, but it's still an analog signal with digital modulation on it. Even frequency hopping, if you will, or spread spectrum, they're little analog pulses that just come up in the right places to convert to data. And I think for a long time, the analog transmitters, when it goes out the antenna and when it goes through all the networks and everything, it's going to be analog stuff. And I think we need to be able to deal with that and not just poo-poo and throw out analog and say no more analog. It's not going to happen. The world is analog, no matter how we may fight that.
David, you followed up on Margaret on a very important point, I think, and that is that, and other folks, you can pitch in if you want. I'm finding very, very often IT people are being pushed into RF. Now, I don't want to just say, oh, it's dangerous, because with proper care, They can do the board swapping that David mentions, or they can be walked through certain things. But Continental shut down for most purposes their 24/7 tech support because they didn't want to get a salesman get his hands inside a transmitter at 2 a.m. How do we get these IT people? I mean, there's 2 tasks here. One, talk to them and communicate, but how do we get them to do RF?
Well, they're already doing RF. There's Wi-Fi and there's Bluetooth.
But there is life above 5 volts, Rich.
Yes.
Yeah.
And 100 milliwatts.
Yeah, Rich, I want to make a comment. They may be doing Wi-Fi, and that Wi-Fi is RF, but
Yeah.
they're not into the actual RF portion of it for the most part. They are dealing with it. Hey, this is a way to get data from one point to the other. They don't understand the RF aspect of it.
Right. And I'm basically just being a smartass.
Right.
But,
Me too.
in one of some of the most incredible people that I've hired have been those problem children. And I like to think of almost everybody in radio, regardless of what you do, as a problem child. I specialized in network programming. And, when you get into talk show hosts, you're dealing with the most problematic people. But the interesting ones to interview were actually the ones that interviewed me, because I could always tell when they were curious about me personally and what the company was like. And particularly at WOR, where the Buckley family was pretty deeply into technology. Rick Buckley would go to his stations and actually help the engineering staff build things. So, when I built the WOR radio network, Rick gave me everything I asked for. And, for people who were running the station, that didn't set too well, because the big money maker, of course, was a 50 kilowatt station in New York City. But he was interested in the network and gave me everything I asked for. And when I was director of station relations for ABC in New York, and pretty much the same thing. I mean, we had some awesome engineering staff there. And, I just can't speak highly enough about them. And at XTRA in Tijuana, my engineering staff was Mexican. And you could literally eat off the floor at our transmitter site in Rosarito. So
unless it was enchilada sauce on the burros.
Yeah.
Joyce, did I see your hand?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say about IT people. If you have IT people doing RF, I think they have to have intensive training, go to the Nortel or whatever transmitter you have and get them trained. And I think they could, some people would rise to the occasion of being able to do that. Yeah. Other than that, other than RF people, I think there should be a lot of cross training. So that you're not left with shifts that can't be filled because people got sick or they have to go out on a family leave or something like that. We're experiencing something like that here at the station, and we need to quickly get people trained. So,
Very
thank you.
good. We've reached.
Sometimes I was going to say, I think we should rebrand ourselves High Power Wireless. Maybe that would work.
We've reached ourselves at about 90 minutes now, and I don't know if you have to leave, Joyce, or I mean, I'm not shutting it off here or anything, but I really appreciate your being here, Richard. I really appreciate your being here. Margaret had to go. She had another Zoom meeting that's where people going today, to Zoom meetings.
Right.
But I wanted to make sure that we thanked you very much for sharing with us your experience.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be here.
And as I say, you don't have to go away. You can
Okay.
certainly. Ted, I
This is-
think you wanted to talk.
Yeah, this has been great. And I keep thinking about a friend of mine who has had to transition from his second long-term full-time job in television engineering with radio, doing side jobs and what have you, into a period for the last 2 or 3 years where he's had to do whatever he could to keep the bills paid, and that's been a struggle. And he's a pretty good engineer, but he's, as somebody else pointed out, I think Dave and some of the other folks are talking about introverts and would rather be working with things, or in this case, lions and tigers at the zoo next door, than interacting with people. And he's not comfortable putting out his shingle, which could attract some contract work that could help him survive. And I think maybe there's a need to also talk about how do engineers, wherever they may find themselves in life and personality, equip themselves to make a transition from working for a company full-time to becoming a contract engineer, or maybe working with a contract engineering company like Dave has, in order to keep the bills paid or grow into something else. I've tried to help him with some marketing or what have you, and anyway, that's a whole nother story. But just some things like that. But this has been a great meeting in a variety of other ways, and thank you for that.
One thing to say to your friend, and that one of the toughest things is, for many of us, the decision to go into the business or make it our career didn't come gradually, or it didn't happen suddenly. It's like, oh, I don't have a job anymore, and I don't want to blame other people for my trouble, but you may be old enough that you're not a great catch for your next would-be employers. You do end up in meetings where they're not convinced you're working for, you will work for the amount of money they're offering. And when your references included the boss of their boss, that is a hard conversation to have with someone. Thing that Harold put up earlier in the chat raised a question with me, and that is, the contract engineering tends not to be very scalable. You have one person and their vehicle and their toolbox and whatever test gear they own or can borrow. But all of the things you need to attract people as employees, you need to be able, first of all, you can't be the person all the time. I take care of about 3 dozen stations. I am not first call for anybody. I'm not first call for the stations I own. Because at some point, a few turns back, I'd had plenty of that. My phone makes no noise. I don't even let it vibrate for most things. The first conversation with mom and pop owners is, let's talk about your safety nets. Do we have some sort of backup in place that if you go off the air, plug this in, flip this switch, do something that you take care of your situation, and then and only then you can find me or try to find me. But if I'm several states away building something, and I like things with beginnings, middles, ends. We just did an automation switch over for a station. Interesting work. A few weeks with programming people and moving all of the program material over and fighting the learning curve and resisting the impulse to say, why don't you call the factory? Their trainers really know much more about it than me. But when you're in the building, you're suddenly one-stop shopping. But I am at about the point where I'd really like to have an assistant, another person to work on this that maybe could take over the business someday if it's going to expand, and scale seems to be what it's going to take, because in the last month, buddy in Dallas was murdered. Buddy in Dallas just died of cancer. The only conversations I have with people lately is, what time is the funeral? And then the phone starts ringing. There are a lot of people getting out of the industry, some a little more abruptly than we would like.
We just lost 2 people up in Michigan, in Illinois, Jeremy Ruck and Dennis Baldridge. Unfortunately, one of the Jeremy was only 50 years old, and Dennis got the COVID. Education was mentioned by at least the last two people, David and really this is, I had the experience, which to me makes it so important for owners to understand. I'm talking in broken sentences, and I apologize. Years ago, you'd come into a station and they'd buy a transmitter, but they would never buy the spare parts because they didn't want to pay the money for the spare parts kit. Today, they'll buy a transmitter or they'll buy an automation system. They won't pay for the education to go to the factory to learn how to do wide orbit or audio vault or whatever. I had a station in this area, calls me up one day, says, I'm having wide orbit, send me a new automation system, and we want to be on the air on the 1st of the month. I said, in 10 days? No, you're thinking about a month and a half just to get on the air, which is what it turned out to take. But there was no discussion whatsoever of sending any of his employees to the audio vault, the wide orbit school. And I would get phone calls every single day of the week asking how to do things. And I said, well, you've got a contractor here who you have a few hours a month of work from, and you're asking me to tell you what it takes people a whole week to learn. And this is something that, I don't know if Ron Castro is still with us, but you want to hire somebody and you want to bring them onto your equipment, they have to know how to use it, how to understand the equipment, how to follow the schematics or the flow chart, whatever. And to me, this is the education problem in so many ways.
That also seems like a good interview question when the party that is applying for the job is in essence interviewing the company. What do you do when you bring in new equipment? Do you send the engineering staff or some of the staff members to the school, or do you bring in a trainer from the company to train the people and make sure that they know how to deal with these pieces of equipment or hardware or software?
If you could get the world to leave you alone for 2 or 3 days just to finish flipping through all the pages of the book.
Yeah. And,
What
and
book?
I've been doing that. I'm learning new things about various pieces of software I interact with, and sometimes it's just stumbling across something where you're moving your mouse pointer and it sits long enough on something and you go, oh, I didn't know that was there. You know, even if you have read the manual.
There was an article in Radio World almost 40 years ago. Barry may have written it. But it said, you're now chief. It said, one of the things you need to do is lock yourself in your office and read every book on the shelves. You need to find them, read them. Do you have fuses for everything? Do you have spare parts for everything? And back in those days, there were these things called parts houses. Kind of nowadays, we have drones delivering from Mauser, so it works out the same. Doug, the drone who delivers here, is very polite. I always tip him well. Oh, wait, that hasn't happened yet. But it was about what do you have and what do you know about it. And if there is a spare procedure like, okay, here are the adapters to put an exciter into the antenna, do you have the wrenches near it in the right size to do it? And for every nut and bolt combination, you will need 2 wrenches because you discover the Newton's laws are really up to date.
Good point.
Well, I think one of the things that is missing in a number of areas, not just what we're dealing with here, but the ability to play with stuff. In my salad days, when in the early 80s, I worked at a 50 kilowatt AM that also had a 50 kilowatt FM that was a Harris 90 automation system. And I had to maintain that overnight when nobody was there. And I got the basic minimum training to deal with changing tapes, programming carts in terms of putting them in the ITC deck and then putting some coding on it with the 90 workstation and so forth. Well, fast forward about 10 years and I'm teaching ROP radio TV at the high school level. And because I knew some of the engineers in the Sacramento area, I was able to call up and go pick up some equipment. Well, one day I get a call, or had contacted the chief engineer of the station I used to work at, and he says, well, bring a truck. And we ended up with, among other things, 4 racks of Harris automation system, which I then got a chance to sit down with the manual and play with, and learned how to use the system in some creative ways and made it do some interesting stuff. But that ability to just spend the time playing with things, or having a duplicate facility. I don't know that everybody's going to have 4 racks of automation system that they can play with, but you know, with the software based stuff that we have today, it should be easy enough to have that as a spare, or as something that you can check the idea you have before you're able to go put it on the air and make sure it works right. It's kind of like spell check. Anyway, that's me.
To follow up on a thought that was triggered in my mind when Dave Stewart was talking, and also with what Ted said, not only is it essential that we educate ourselves, but a big part of the job is educating the folks we're working with. I can think of a situation where we had a group of stations that wanted to put RDS on their stations. There was no documentation for this group. They had mix and match systems. And when I sent one of our guys out there to take a look at it, he had to spend some time getting up to speed on how what capabilities they had as far as getting the RDS signal out to the sites was, which equipment they had purchased before, you know, talking with us about it. They just bought, you know, harem scarum. And after they got the bill, they were very upset that we were billing them for the time that I spent on learning their system. The idea being, we hire you to come in and do this work. We didn't hire you to pay your tuition and you billing us to learn our system. But yeah, I was able to talk to them, and hey, you know, you don't have anything in terms of the information we need. I've asked you to provide documentation, knowing very well the capability to do the research. But so the thing is it about us educating ourselves, but it's also educating our clients.
I told a story the other day when I was doing engineering here for the local Clear Channel cluster, iHeart now. Somehow, and I finally figured out why, but every afternoon, about 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, their main money-making transmitter would start to drift up in power, get up to 104, 105, 108%. And until I found out what was going on, I'd go into the rack room, go off to the power trim setting and press lower briefly. And the station would promptly go off the air. I never understood that for about 2 weeks. So I went up to the transmitter and I spent some time and worked my way through all the wiring in the back, Mr. Stewart. And I discovered that for lower, the power trim was wired to filament off. And it had been that way for some time. I don't know why the person who originally did it that way, but I can only tell you that after I put the wires the right place, the power system worked properly, and we never had the rising power in the afternoon again, and we never went off the air unexpectedly.
But in his defense, it did work. It lowered the power.
Oh, boy.